This is chapter 5, part 4. Let's continue on. Next point here. Now, we were talking about the pros and cons, or, the proponents and opponents of mandatory sentencing policies. One thing that the textbook does not stress, and again, I feel like this is one of the things I want to do in these lectures, is sort of fill in where the textbook, as I see it, misses something, or push back a little bit on some things that the textbook is saying. To give other perspectives, try to show all sides. One thing the textbook does not stress is that one of the reasons why minimum sentencing was promoted, and not and wider, more broadly than mandatory minimums, was other policies to take what they call discretion out of the hands of judges. Meaning, let's make things more mandatory, more, if they're convicted of this, they get this, so that the judge has less power to use his or her discretion about what penalties could be. And some of the motivation for this was the belief by many kind of criminal justice advocates, lobbyists, people pushing for different things, was the belief that a lot of judges were biased, and that they were giving harsher sentences to some folks compared to other folks, and that in particular that the judges were possibly or allegedly racially biased, and so that if you made these policies that sort of applied to everybody equally and took the discretion out of the judge's hands, that you would get greater equality, equal treatment, and less bias, less discrimination. So that was some of the quite an important idea behind these sort of mandatory policies, was suspiciousness about the judges. But what it ended up doing, instead of kind of giving more equal treatment, was what it did in effect, in reality, was just to be more. They made the system more punitive, more punishing, more stricter, and so you, instead of judges being able to kind of go easy on people and give people a second chance, sometimes depending on the circumstances, the judges' hands were tied, and so it ended up just being kind of a get tough policy, again with the intention of trying to eliminate bias. Critics of mandatory minimum sentencing argued that these sentences filled Americans' prisons with minor players, such as drug abusers, rather than major drug traffickers. So if you have kind of lack of discretion and you're just kind of tough on everybody, it's going to pick up a lot of small time people and punish them as severely as the more serious criminals. So this is one of the arguments of the critics of these policies. They argued that being tough diverted money away from other social needs. If you're spending all this money on prisons and jails and the criminal justice system, that you'll have less money for drug abuse prevention, education, treatment. So they were, so because there's only a finite number of dollars out there, and so you either have, to some extent, you have to use them for this, that, or the other. And they were saying that they could be better spent on these more constructive, positive kind of approaches. Since 1992, however, okay, so now we're moving forward a little bit, although this is still a long time ago. Sentencing reforms have caught hold with the American public, and more specifically, state legislators. State laws regarding mandatory sentences have been modified or rescinded largely through lobbying efforts. So there's been different organizations. The textbook gives more specifics. Prison reform advocates or criminal law advocates, criminal law reform advocates who've been pushing to relax these sentences and get away from such strict policies, such strict laws. So this has been a gradual movement over the past few decades, responding again to the get tough policies of the 70s and the 80s. But I would say overall that this reaction, this working to relax laws, has been a gradual, slow process and not anything dramatic. So it's been, it's been a long process that's been, I think, kind of an uphill battle. In recent years, there has been a significant shift towards providing judges with a greater degree of discretion in their sentencing of drug offenders. So again, people have turned against the idea of tying the judge's hands. They've become more convinced that maybe actually judges, if you give them more discretion, more power, more authority, that they can use it to go easier on criminals who have who under certain circumstances that may make their crimes look a little differently than some other criminals. So again, there's been sort of a shift in greater trust placed in judges' hands. Now, so we're talking here about kind of a shift in public opinion that has happened gradually in the past few decades. And I think maybe the best way to summarize this in a real simple fashion is to just look at public opinion polls on the issue, when I'm talking about drugs, on just one issue that's polled a lot, which is asking people whether they think that marijuana possession should be made legal or not. It's been a question that's been asked by the survey that's called the General Social Survey since the early 70s, since 1973. They've been asking a nationally representative sample of adult Americans, hey, do you think marijuana should be legal or not? And you can see that this graph here summarizes this General Social Survey, GSS, data going all the way back to 1973 and then moving forward all the way to 2022, which is our most recent data. The red line that you see there are the folks who think that marijuana should be legalized, that it should be legal. And you can see that all through the 70s and the 80s and into the early 90s, you had low public support for legalization of marijuana. The line bounces around some, but it's basically in the 20s, or even in the 80s, in the 1980s there, you can see it dip lower than the 20s. It's in the teens. Only between 15 and 20% of Americans during that period of time, during the 80s, thought that marijuana should be legal. So the vast majority, that blue line, is showing the people who are against legalization, and then we're talking over 80% in the 1980s. So sort of rejection of marijuana peaked during that period of time. And I should say, just coincidentally, that you did see this reaction against the drug use, illegal drug use, peaked around 1980, and then it came down during the 80s. So that less and less drug use in the 80s sort of matches this dislike, this disapproval of marijuana that you see in the high numbers of disapproval in the 1980s on this graph here. But then we see a shift starting in the early 90s. Then you see that red line starting to drift up gradually. And it's a pretty steady increase from the early 90s through to the present day. It's been, you get a little bouncing around, but overall there's been this gradual increase over the past 30 plus years of favoring more and more legalization. And you can see that the people who are pro-legalization became a larger group of people, that red and blue line crossed in the early 2010s. It looks like about 2012, you see a crossing where now we have a majority of people in favor of legalization. That red line continues up, and it continues up after 2012 at a steady pace all the way up to the current day, where you have something like in the low 70s, low 70 plus percent of adult Americans favor legalization. So it's been kind of a flipping. It's flipped compared to how things were in the 70s and especially the 80s. So this is a very simple way to kind of summarize public sentiment, and that it's sort of more favorable towards legalization of marijuana, and more broadly speaking, is taking a little bit of a more permissive, tolerant approach to drug use than in previous decades. So that trend has been steady and continues to this day. And this is, of course, parallels many states across the country that have legalized marijuana either for medicinal purposes or for recreational purposes. So that's a good way to graphically show public sentiment over the years. Penalties with respect to powder cocaine and crack cocaine were revised because of the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 to reduce a disparity that had been considered unjust. So the chapter talks about how there was legislation passed to be extra punitive, more punitive with crack cocaine than with powder cocaine. Now, a lot of times this is put in the history, sort of put in sort of racial terms, that it was sort of a racist discrepancy between treatment of crack cocaine and powder cocaine. But I think it's important to understand here a little more context that a lot of the people who were really advocating and pushing for a crackdown, getting tough with selling crack cocaine was because it was so devastating to these inner city poor communities of color, and that there was so much fallout. There's so many negative consequences on women and children and men, and I mean, I witnessed it when I lived in New York City in the 1980s. It was the crack epidemic was really harsh. And so you had a lot of people advocating for tough sentencing and cracking down on it because it was so devastating in these communities. And you had, and a lot of times people who took the lead on this were, for example, in Congress, the Black Caucus was advocating for this kind of get tough policy. So a lot of it had to do with sort of concern, social concern, and thinking that the way to address the social problem was to get tough on crack cocaine. See, powder cocaine was a drug that was used, more likely to be used by wealthy people because it is expensive, and it was famously, used among celebrities, among Hollywood people, that kind of stuff in the 70s, and then going into the 80s. And so people saw addiction from that, and a lot of people went to rehab and had to get treatment for cocaine addiction and that sort of thing. But these are kind of more privileged, well-off folks, and so there was sort of a less drive to feel like you need to crack down and get tough, because it didn't seem like powder cocaine was so devastating to communities, to vulnerable people, poor people who already had it tough. And so there's a little bit of context. It's a little more of a more complicated picture than you just, sort of look at it in racialized terms. Anyway, between the early 1970s and the late 2000s, mandatory minimum sentences and other get tough strategies contributed to a substantial rise in the rate of incarceration in America, which disproportionately affected minorities and women. Yes, you certainly saw large increases in incarceration rates for both of these populations, especially with women. Women traditionally are a very low percent of prison inmates, less than 10%. And a lot of a big difference between males and females is that males are much more likely to commit serious violent offenses like rape, sexual assault, murder, aggravated assault, robbery. Those are very predominantly male involved committed crimes. Not 100%, but we're talking, 85, 90% of those crimes. And so because of that, you have much greater numbers of males in prison than females. But so with this low baseline of females in prison, when females are getting involved in drugs and drug sales, drug possession, drug use, that since their numbers were low at baseline, their numbers went up a lot uh, because uh, because this was folks who were either because of drug possession or drug sales who were swept up by the criminal justice system. There was a significant number of females, and so those numbers went up a lot for that group. And the same thing for minority populations, ethnic, racial minority populations as well. Uh, the the incarceration. Well, let me say that I do need to say that while this true that those incarceration numbers went up dramatically, you did see that it's starting in 1994, 1995. You saw a dramatic decrease in violent crime in the United States, property crime, all sorts of crimes. It dropped dramatically in the second half of the 1990s and into the 2000s and beyond. And the best research that has looked at this has found that part of that story, the reason why violent crime, property crime fell so much during that period of time was you had so many criminally prone people locked up and so incapacitated and unable to be on the streets committing crime. Anyway, so the incarceration rate in the United States declined in 2010. So we've seen a gradual drop starting in the past decade plus, and the first time since it had done so in 1972. Um, the use of lengthy community supervision terms is also undergoing examination with greater focus on rehabilitation, effective reentry for nonviolent drug abusing offenders. So again, the main final story here is a shift towards a little bit less towards the get tough, throw them in prison approach, with a little bit more let's focus more on rehabilitation, particularly for those who are nonviolent offenders, more minor offenders, may have a drug abuse problem, um, but maybe the community is not best served by long prison sentences, but rather a focus on more positive approaches like rehabilitation. Anyway, so those are the problem. I'm trying to think if there's any other, main points from this chapter. There's certainly some things I didn't have time to go over in detail. Make sure that you go over those items that I listed before that are important. But I think I've done a pretty good job hitting most of a lot of the important points. We'll leave it there.